The sound of diesel engines roaring to life at 5:30 in the morning wasn't unusual in rural Millbrook County, but the convoy of dump trucks rumbling past the Henderson family farm was something else entirely. Sarah Henderson pressed her face against the kitchen window, coffee mug forgotten in her hand, watching as the third truck in 10 minutes disappeared around the bend toward the old Patterson property. "Grandpa Joe, you need to see this," she called toward the back porch, where her 82-year-old grandfather was already dressed and reading the morning paper in his favorite rocking chair. Joseph Joe Henderson had lived on this land for 63 years, ever since he'd bought the 100-acre spread with his discharge money from Korea. He'd seen neighbors come and go, watched family farms get swallowed up by developers, and witnessed the slow transformation of their quiet corner of the county into something he barely recognized. But he'd never seen anything like what was happening next door. The Patterson farm had been sold 6 months ago to Meridian Construction, a company that specialized in high-end residential developments. The Pattersons, an elderly couple who'd farmed the adjacent land for 40 years, had finally succumbed to the financial pressures that were crushing small farmers across the state. Their children had moved to the cities, their equipment was aging, and the offer from Meridian had been too generous to refuse. Joe shuffled into the kitchen, his weathered hands gripping his walking cane. At first glance, he appeared frail, thin white hair, stooped shoulders, and the careful movements of a man whose body had absorbed 8 decades of hard living. But his pale blue eyes held a sharpness that suggested the mind behind them was as keen as ever. "What's got you so worked up, sweetheart?" he asked, though he could already hear the answer in the increasing rumble of heavy machinery. Sarah pointed toward the window. "They've been hauling stuff over there since dawn. Big trucks, construction equipment. I thought they weren't supposed to start the development until next spring." Joe peered through the glass, his jaw tightening as he watched another dump truck lumber past their mailbox. The truck's bed was piled high with what looked like construction debris, chunks of concrete, twisted rebar, and piles of gravel. Not the kind of materials you'd expect to see going into a construction site, but rather the kind you'd expect to see coming out of a demolition. "That's not development material," Joe muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "That's dump material." The realization hit them both at the same time. The trucks weren't delivering supplies for construction, they were dumping waste. And from the direction they were traveling, the most logical dumping ground would be the low-lying section of the Patterson property that bordered the Henderson land. The same section that contained the natural drainage basin that fed into Henderson Creek, which supplied water to their livestock and irrigation system. The same section that, according to the property survey Joe had carefully preserved in his filing cabinet, actually belonged to the Henderson family by about 20 feet. A boundary dispute that had remained friendly and unresolved for decades because the Pattersons had been good neighbors. Joe's grip tightened on his cane as the fourth truck of the morning rolled past, its suspension groaning under the weight of its load. These weren't good neighbors. These were strangers who had bought land and apparently assumed they could do whatever they pleased with it, regardless of the consequences for the people who had been there long before Meridian Construction was even a name on a business license. "Sarah," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had spent his life solving problems, "call your cousin Danny at the county planning office. Ask him about permits for dumping operations, and then call the Environmental Protection Agency." Sarah nodded, already reaching for her phone, but she could see something in her grandfather's expression that made her pause. It was the same look he'd had when developers had tried to buy their land 5 years ago, the same look he'd had when the county had tried to run a highway through their property in the 90s. It was the look of a man who was done being pushed around. As another truck rumbled past, Joe Henderson began planning his response. He'd been polite and patient for 63 years, watching his community change around him, adapting to progress and trying to be reasonable. But there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, and dumping industrial waste next to a family farm was clearly on the wrong side of one of those lines. What Meridian Construction didn't know was that they'd just picked a fight with the wrong old man, hotter than a summer day in August. First, Meridian Construction had no permits for waste disposal on the Patterson property. Second, they were dumping directly into what was legally Henderson land, according to the 1987 survey he'd found buried in his files. Third, the runoff from their illegal dump site was already contaminating Henderson Creek. Danny Morrison, Sarah's cousin at the county planning office, had been apologetic but clear about the bureaucratic reality. "Uncle Joe, even with all the evidence you've got, it's going to take weeks to get an inspector out there, maybe months to get them shut down. And that's if the complaint doesn't get buried in red tape." The Environmental Protection Agency had been even less encouraging. The automated phone system had kept Joe on hold for 47 minutes before connecting him to a bored-sounding clerk who promised someone would look into it within 30 business days. 30 business days. While Meridian Construction dumped God knows what kind of industrial waste 20 feet onto his property, poisoning the creek that had run clean for over a century. Joe stood at his back fence, staring across the field at the growing mountain of debris. What had started as a modest pile that morning was now a hill of concrete chunks, rusty metal, and gravel that stretched across nearly an acre. The smell of diesel fuel and something chemical he couldn't identify drifted across the distance, carried by the afternoon breeze. "They're not even trying to hide it," he muttered, raising his grandfather's old binoculars, the same pair the old man had used to spot German positions in France during World War I. Through the lenses, Joe could see workers in hard hats directing truck after truck to dump their loads. No environmental protection, no containment barriers, just raw waste being poured directly onto the ground. One worker caught Joe's attention, a man in an expensive suit and hard hat who seemed to be supervising the operation. Even from a distance, Joe could see the man's arrogant posture as he gestured broadly at the dumping area, obviously pleased with the efficiency of the operation. "Sarah," Joe called toward the house. "Bring me that camera with the big lens." For the next 2 hours, Joe documented everything. License plates on the trucks, photos of the waste piles, pictures of contaminated water seeping toward Henderson Creek. He even managed to get a clear shot of the man in the suit, who he later learned from a quick internet search was Marcus Webb, Meridian Construction's Vice President of Operations. The same Marcus Webb who lived in Willowbrook Estates, the county's most exclusive neighborhood, in a house that featured prominently on the company's website as an example of their luxury lifestyle developments. The same Marcus Webb whose $2.3 million home, according to the real estate listing Sarah found online, boasted a resort-style infinity pool with premium stone decking and integrated spa features. That evening, Joe sat in his study surrounded by printed photographs, property surveys, and legal documents. Sarah had made dinner, but it sat untouched on his desk while he worked. At 82, his mind was as sharp as it had been at 30, and right now it was focused on a single problem. How does an old farmer make a powerful construction company understand that actions have consequences? The legal system would take months. The environmental agencies were overwhelmed and underfunded. The county officials were either bought off or too intimidated to challenge a company like Meridian. But Joe Henderson had learned a long time ago that sometimes the most effective solutions came from thinking outside the conventional channels. He picked up one of the photographs, a crystal-clear image of Marcus Webb standing proudly next to a dump truck full of gravel and concrete debris. Then he looked at the real estate listing showing Webb's beautiful backyard pool, sparkling blue in the afternoon sun. A slow smile spread across Joe's weathered face. "Sarah," he called toward the kitchen, "do you still have that friend who works for the catering company? The one who services all those fancy parties in Willowbrook Estates?" "You mean Jenny? Sure, why?" "I need to know Marcus Webb's schedule, specifically when he and his family might be taking a vacation." Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, a puzzled expression on her face. "Grandpa, what are you planning?" Joe looked up from the photographs, his pale blue eyes twinkling with something that was half mischief and half cold calculation. "I'm planning to return some property that doesn't belong to them," he said simply. "All of it." Jenny Martinez had been catering high-end events in Willowbrook Estates for 8 years, long enough to know which clients tipped well, which ones complained about everything, and which ones treated service staff like furniture. Marcus Webb fell squarely into the last category. "He's throwing some kind of corporate retreat next weekend," Jenny told Sarah over coffee at Millbrook's only diner. "Big party for his construction company executives. They're all flying down to his place in the Bahamas Thursday morning, won't be back until the following Tuesday." Sarah stirred her coffee absently, still not entirely sure why her grandfather needed this information. The whole family. Wife, 2 teenage kids, the works. He was very specific about wanting the house completely cleaned and secured while they're gone. Even hired extra security to patrol the neighborhood. Jenny paused. "Why's your grandpa asking about Marcus Webb? That man's bad news, Sarah. Real bad news." "What do you mean?" Jenny glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned forward. "Last month, my company catered a birthday party for his daughter. Huge affair, maybe 200 people. While I'm setting up the buffet, I overhear him on the phone talking about some disposal problem being solved by dumping it out in farm country where nobody important will complain. He was laughing about it." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Farm country. That could only mean one place. "There's more," Jenny continued. His wife was bragging to her friends about how Marcus had found a way to save the company millions by avoiding proper waste disposal fees. Said it was going to pay for their new yacht. That evening, Sarah sat across from her grandfather at the kitchen table, sharing what she'd learned. Joe listened without speaking, his weathered fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the oak surface his own father had built 70 years ago. 5 days, he said finally. Thursday to Tuesday. "Grandpa, whatever you're thinking, maybe we should just wait for the authorities." "Honey," Joe interrupted gently, "I got a call from Danny this afternoon. The county inspector won't be available until next month. Something about budget cuts and staffing shortages. And that EPA fellow. He says our complaint has been escalated to the appropriate department for review." Joe stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the field where Henderson Creek used to run clear and clean. Now, even in the fading light, they could see the ugly sheen of contamination on the water's surface. "Your great-grandmother used to wash clothes in that creek," he said quietly. "Your grandmother taught your mother to swim in the swimming hole just past those cottonwoods. 4 generations of Hendersons have depended on that water." He turned back to Sarah, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before, not anger, but a cold, absolute determination. "I'm 82 years old, sweetheart. I don't have time to wait for bureaucrats to do their jobs while that creek dies and our land gets poisoned. Sometimes an old man has to handle things the old-fashioned way." The next morning, Joe drove his pickup truck through Willowbrook Estates like he belonged there. He'd borrowed one of Sarah's business suits. She was a real estate agent and carried a clipboard and measuring tape. To anyone watching, he looked like a contractor or inspector making his rounds. Marcus Webb's house was everything the online photos had suggested and more. A sprawling modern mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows, manicured gardens, and a backyard that looked like something from a luxury resort magazine. The infinity pool was the centerpiece, a stunning oval of crystal-clear water that seemed to spill seamlessly into the horizon, surrounded by imported Italian stone and dotted with floating LED lights. Joe parked across the street and spent 20 minutes documenting everything with his camera. The pool's dimensions, the layout of the backyard, the height of the privacy fence, the location of security cameras. Most importantly, he noted the pool's filtration system and the access gate that would allow service vehicles to reach the backyard. His military training from Korea was still there, buried under 6 decades of farming and family life, but sharp when he needed it. Reconnaissance, planning, execution. As he was preparing to leave, a landscaping truck pulled into Webb's driveway. Joe watched as 3 workers began unloading equipment, and an idea began forming in his mind. That afternoon, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to Tommy Rodriguez, who ran a small excavation business and owed Joe a favor from when Joe had let him graze his horses on Henderson land during a tough season. The second was to his old army buddy Pete Kowalski, who now managed a trucking company and had been complaining for months about having nowhere to dispose of clean construction debris. The third was to Sarah's friend Jenny, who had just given him a very interesting piece of information about the timing of Webb's weekly pool service. "You sure about this, Joe?" Tommy asked when they met at the diner that evening. "This Webb character sounds like he's got lawyers coming out of his ears." Joe spread out the property survey on the table between them, pointing to the clearly marked boundary lines. "Tommy, look at these coordinates. That waste pile isn't just on my land. It's contaminating my water supply. Far as I'm concerned, I'm just reclaiming my property." Pete laughed when Joe explained what he needed. "You want me to haul what to where?" "Joe, you old devil, I always said you were too smart to be just a farmer." "Can you do it?" "Hell yes, I can do it. Question is, can you live with the consequences?" Joe looked out the diner window toward his farm, where the lights from the illegal dump site glowed like a small industrial complex against the night sky. Then he thought about Marcus Webb laughing on the phone about dumping waste when nobody important will complain. "Pete," he said quietly, "I've been living with consequences my whole life. Time for Mr. Webb to learn what that feels like." The Webb's private jet lifted off from the county airport at 8:47 a.m. on Thursday, right on schedule. Joe Henderson watched from his kitchen window as the contrail disappeared into the morning sky, then picked up his phone to make the first call. "Tommy, it's time." By 10 o'clock, Tommy Rodriguez's excavator was positioned at the edge of the illegal dump site on Henderson's property. The machine's hydraulic arm bit into the mountain of construction debris with mechanical precision, filling the first dump truck with exactly the same concrete chunks, twisted rebar, and contaminated gravel that Meridian Construction had deposited there. "Jesus, Joe," Tommy called down from the cab, "this stuff reeks. What the hell were they dumping here?" Joe stood beside the truck, wearing his old work coveralls and a hard hat that had seen better decades. Despite his age, he moved with purpose and energy that surprised even himself. Industrial waste, chemical runoff, probably asbestos from old building demolitions. The kind of stuff that costs real money to dispose of properly. Pete Kowalski's truck convoy arrived at noon, 5 heavy-duty dump trucks and a water tanker. Pete climbed down from the lead vehicle, grinning like a man about to witness something spectacular. "You sure about the timing on this, Joe?" Joe checked his watch against the schedule Jenny had provided. "Pool service comes every Thursday at 2 p.m. Security patrol makes their rounds at 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. We've got a 2-hour window. And if we get caught." Joe pulled out his copy of the property survey and the photographs he'd taken of a contaminated creek. "Pete, every load we're moving came from my land without my permission. Far as the law's concerned, I'm just relocating my property." The convoy moved through Willowbrook Estates like a perfectly coordinated military operation. Joe had spent 2 days timing the route, identifying which streets had the least traffic and which neighbors were likely to be at work. Tommy followed in the excavator, moving slowly but steadily toward their destination. At 1:45 p.m., they reached Marcus Webb's street. The security guard had finished his patrol 15 minutes earlier, just as Jenny had predicted. The pool service truck was nowhere to be seen, apparently running late, which was fine with Joe. The neighborhood was quiet, most residents either at work or behind closed doors enjoying their air conditioning. Joe had prepared for this moment by obtaining something that made their operation completely legal, a work permit. Not from the county, he'd learned it would take weeks. Instead, he'd filed a property recovery claim with the sheriff's department, complete with survey documentation proving the waste had been illegally dumped on Henderson land. The deputy who'd processed the paperwork had been sympathetic, especially after seeing the photos of the contaminated creek. "You got the right to reclaim your property, Mr. Henderson," Deputy Martinez had told him. "Just make sure you don't damage anything that isn't yours." Joe intended to be very careful about that. Tommy positioned the excavator in Webb's backyard while Pete's trucks lined up in formation. The privacy fence that was supposed to keep prying eyes out now worked perfectly to shield their operation from curious neighbors. Webb's infinity pool was even more magnificent up close, a pristine oval of crystal clear water that probably cost more than most people's houses. The imported Italian stone decking, the LED lighting system, the integrated spa that bubbled softly in one corner. It was beautiful, expensive, and about to become very different. "Start with the gravel," Joe instructed. "We want good drainage at the bottom." Tommy's excavator arm swung over the pool with mechanical precision. The first load of contaminated gravel hit the water with a splash that sent waves cascading over the stone deck. The clear blue water immediately turned murky brown. "That's for Henderson Creek," Joe said quietly. The second load contained chunks of concrete and twisted rebar. The debris crashed into the shallow end with enough force to crack the tile lining. "That's for 4 generations of clean water." Load after load followed. Construction debris, contaminated soil, rusted metal, and chemical-stained gravel. Each dump truck emptied its contents into the pool with methodical efficiency. The water, when it was still visible between the debris, had turned an ugly black color that exactly matched the contamination in Henderson Creek. By 3:30, Webb's beautiful infinity pool had become an exact replica of the illegal dump site on Henderson's property, a mountain of industrial waste surrounded by contaminated water. Marcus Webb's Mercedes pulled into his driveway at 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday, the back seat loaded with duty-free shopping bags and vacation souvenirs. His wife, Cheryl, was already planning their next trip as they stepped out of the car, chattering about the resort's spa treatments and the yacht they'd toured. "The kids are exhausted," she said, glancing back at their teenagers who were dragging luggage from the trunk. "I think I'll order takeout tonight, and we can just relax by the pool." Marcus nodded absently, scrolling through emails on his phone. 5 days of Caribbean paradise had left him refreshed and ready to tackle the quarterly profit reports that awaited him. The illegal dumping operation had already saved Meridian Construction over $2 million in disposal fees, and his bonus was going to be spectacular. "Dad," his 17-year-old daughter called from the backyard gate, "something's wrong with the pool." Marcus looked up from his phone, irritated by the interruption. "What kind of wrong?" "The cleaning service was supposed to." His daughter's scream cut through the afternoon air. Marcus dropped his phone and ran toward the backyard, Cheryl close behind him. What he saw when he rounded the corner of the house made him stop so suddenly that his wife crashed into his back. His beautiful infinity pool, the centerpiece of his $2.3 million home, the crown jewel of his backyard paradise, was gone. In its place was a mountain of construction debris, twisted metal, and concrete chunks that rose nearly 8 feet above the pool deck. The imported Italian stone was stained with oil and chemicals, and the air reeked of industrial waste. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, then found his voice. "What the hell happened to my pool?" A piece of paper was taped to the pool house door, fluttering in the afternoon breeze. Marcus ripped it down with shaking hands and read the typed message. "Mr. Webb, you have been reclaiming property that belongs to the Henderson family farm, specifically construction waste illegally dumped on our land without permits or environmental protection. We have simply returned your property to its rightful owner. The contaminated materials in your former pool came directly from your company's illegal dump site, along with water from Henderson Creek, which your operations have poisoned. We trust you will dispose of these materials properly this time, using licensed waste management services. Joseph Henderson. P.S. The Meridian Construction logo block in the center is yours to keep." Marcus's hands were trembling as he read the letter a second time, then a third, The implications were staggering. If this old farmer had documented everything, if he had proof of the illegal dumping, if he'd involved lawyers. Marcus. Cheryl's voice was small and frightened. What does it say? But Marcus was already pulling out his phone, dialing his lawyer's emergency number. Then the environmental cleanup company. Then his insurance agent. Then Meridian's crisis management team. Each conversation was worse than the last. The lawyer was blunt. Marcus, if they have documentation proving you dumped waste on their property without permits, you're looking at criminal charges, not just civil liability. Environmental crimes carry serious federal penalties. The cleanup company was even less encouraging. We'll need to test everything before we can move it. If there's asbestos or chemical contamination, you're looking at $250,000 just for removal, maybe more for environmental remediation. His insurance agent delivered the final blow. Intentional environmental dumping isn't covered under your policy. You're on your own for this one. By evening, Marcus Webb was sitting in his living room surrounded by lawyers, environmental specialists, and corporate damage control experts. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the mountain of debris that had once been his backyard oasis, illuminated by floodlights brought in by the hazmat team. How did some old farmer pull this off? He asked his head of security, a man who commanded serious money to protect exactly this kind of disaster. Joseph Henderson, 82 years old, Korean War veteran, the security chief read from his tablet. Filed a legal property recovery claim with the sheriff's department on Friday. Everything he did was technically within his rights, since the materials originally came from his land. Technically within his rights. Marcus's voice rose to a near shout. He destroyed my pool. Actually, his lawyer interjected carefully. He didn't destroy anything. He relocated materials that belonged to him from one location to another. The fact that you chose to store those materials in a swimming pool is legally irrelevant. Marcus stared at his lawyer in disbelief. You're telling me this is legal? I'm telling you that prosecuting an 82-year-old veteran for reclaiming his own property from your backyard is going to be a public relations nightmare, especially when the media learns about the illegal dumping that preceded it. That word, media, sent a chill through Marcus that was colder than any Caribbean breeze. He thought about the company's stock price, about his position at Meridian, about the federal environmental investigation that was almost certainly coming. What are my options? He asked quietly. The room fell silent except for the sound of heavy machinery outside, where workers were setting up containment barriers around what used to be his pool. His lawyer cleared his throat. Well, you could sue Mr. Henderson for property damage, but that would require admitting in court that you illegally dumped construction waste on his land. You could file criminal charges, but again, you'd have to explain how your materials ended up on his property in the first place. Or, Marcus prompted, or you could clean up the mess, both here and on Henderson's land, and hope this doesn't turn into a federal case. 3 weeks later, Joe Henderson sat on his back porch, watching as Meridian Construction's cleanup crews finished removing the last of the contaminated soil from his property. Henderson Creek was running clear again for the first time in a month, and the environmental testing had come back clean. Sarah handed him a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. The headline in the local section made him smile. Construction executive faces federal investigation following environmental dumping scandal. The article was thorough. Marcus Webb had been fired from Meridian Construction pending the EPA investigation. His house was for sale, the cleanup costs having exceeded his savings. The company's stock had plummeted, and 3 other illegal dumping sites had been discovered during the federal investigation. You feeling satisfied, Grandpa? Sarah asked, settling into the chair beside him. Joe looked out over his land, the clean creek, the restored pasture, the absence of industrial stench in the morning air. At 82, he'd learned that satisfaction wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about consequences, about making sure that people who thought they could poison other people's land understood that actions have results. "I'm feeling like justice got served," he said simply, along with a lesson about treating your neighbors with respect. A car pulled into their driveway, a modest sedan that looked distinctly out of place compared to the luxury vehicles that usually belong to people seeking Joe's attention these days. An elderly man got out, moving slowly but with dignity. It was Marcus Webb. Joe watched as the man who had laughed about dumping waste, where nobody important will complain, walked toward the porch. Webb looked older, beaten down by the weight of consequences he'd never expected to face. "Mr. Henderson," Webb said when he reached the bottom of the porch steps, "I came to apologize." Joe studied the man for a long moment. Webb's expensive clothes had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing. His arrogant posture was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who'd learned humility the hard way. "Apology accepted," Joe said finally. "But the lesson was never about apologies, Mr. Webb. It was about understanding that every piece of land belongs to somebody, and that somebody matters." Webb nodded, his eyes fixed on Henderson Creek, which sparkled clean and clear in the morning sun. "I understand that now," he said quietly. "I should have understood it before." As Webb's sedan disappeared down the county road, Joe Henderson allowed himself one final moment of satisfaction. At 82, he'd proven that age and wisdom could still triumph over money and arrogance. He'd shown that even powerful men had to face consequences for their actions. Most importantly, he'd ensured that Henderson Creek would run clean for another generation of his family. Sometimes, an old farmer's justice was the most effective justice of all.